My successful son refused $3,500 for my cancer surgery. My struggling daughter gave me everything she had. Everyone tells you that the child you help the most is the one who'll be there when you need help back. Until you find out the truth has nothing to do with how much you gave someone, and everything to do with who they decided to become. My name is Walton Ferris. I'm 66 years old, and I live in Briar Crossing, Tennessee, in a small brick ranch house I've owned outright for 18 years, where I still tend a half-acre vegetable garden every summer out of habit from a childhood spent on my grandfather's farm, and where I still fix my own truck in the driveway rather than pay a mechanic. Even now, even with what I know today about the cost of things I once assumed I could always handle myself. I used to believe that the son I'd put through college co-signed a business loan for, and bragged about to every stranger in a diner booth, would be the first one at my side if I ever truly needed help. I was wrong, and it took one phone call and $3,500 for me to understand exactly how wrong. Before I tell you what happened, I want to ask you something small. If you've ever discovered that generosity doesn't run in a straight line back to you just because you were generous first, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, but it tells me you're still with me, and that means more than you'd think. Now let me tell you about my son. His name is Marcus Ferris, and he's 38 years old. A commercial real estate broker who built a firm from nothing over the past decade into something genuinely impressive, closing deals now that run into the millions on a regular basis. I'd always been proud of him in the specific, complicated way you're proud of a child who succeeded past anything you ever managed yourself. He drove a black Range Rover he kept immaculate, never a smudge on the leather seats. He wore a particular brand of watch he'd mentioned casually in conversation, the way people do when they want you to ask about the price without asking directly. He called me Dad, in a slightly clipped way on the phone now, always sounding a little rushed, like our conversations were squeezed between more important ones. He'd started, over the past few years, sending money instead of showing up, a check for Father's Day instead of a visit, a gift card instead of a phone call on my birthday, transactions standing in for a relationship he'd apparently decided didn't need the relationship part anymore. I told myself that was just how successful people operated, that the money meant he still cared, even if the time didn't follow it. I thought 38 years of raising that boy bought me the certainty that if it ever really mattered, he'd show up in person. I was about to learn how wrong that certainty was. The week it happened started with a routine checkup that turned into anything but routine. My doctor found something on a scan that led to a biopsy, and the biopsy led to a diagnosis of early-stage prostate cancer. Caught early enough, my oncologist assured me that surgery had an excellent success rate if we moved quickly. The surgery itself would be covered mostly by my Medicare and supplemental insurance, but there was a gap, $3,500, for a specialized pre-surgical procedure my insurance classified as elective, despite my surgeon insisting it significantly reduced complication risk given my age and overall health. I didn't have that kind of money sitting free in my savings, not after replacing my roof the year before and helping my daughter with a car repair that spring. Nothing about that week suggested anything beyond ordinary bad luck. That's usually how it goes, isn't it? You brace yourself for the diagnosis, and it's the phone call afterward that actually breaks something in you. I called Marcus on a Tuesday evening, rehearsing what I'd say for almost an hour before I dialed, hating how much it cost me just to ask. He picked up sounding distracted, background noise suggesting he was still at the office, and I told him about the diagnosis, about the surgery, about the $3,500 gap, keeping my voice as steady and unemotional as I could manage, the way you do when you're afraid your own child might hear neediness in your voice and pull away from it. Dad, I'm sorry. That's a lot to process right now. I've actually got a lot going on this week. We just closed a $12 million deal, and I'm buried in closing paperwork," Marcus said. And I remember the specific, strange sensation of hearing my son mention $12 million in the same breath as declining to help me pay for cancer surgery. There's no money for you right now, Dad. Everything's tied up in the deal. Commissions don't clear for another month, minimum. Can you ask your insurance for a payment plan or something?" I sat there holding the phone, feeling something in my chest go quiet, and still, in a way anger usually doesn't. "Marcus, it's cancer surgery." "I know, Dad, and I feel terrible about it. I really do, but I genuinely don't have liquid cash right now. Everything's committed." His voice had that same clipped efficiency he used on business calls, and I realized, listening to it, that he was handling me the exact same way he probably handled a vendor asking for early payment on an invoice he didn't feel like prioritizing. "I'll figure something out for you soon, okay? I gotta run. I've got a call in 5 minutes." He hung up before I could say anything else, and I sat in my kitchen for a long time afterward, staring at the phone, doing math in my head that had nothing to do with dollars and everything to do with 38 years. Here's something nobody tells you about the moment your own child chooses convenience over you. It doesn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrives in a calm, reasonable voice, explaining why now just isn't a good time, delivered with the same tone you'd use to decline a coworker's fundraiser request. And somehow, that calm, reasonable tone cuts deeper than anger ever could. 2 days later, my daughter Josephine showed up at my house unannounced, still in her scrubs from an overnight shift at the county hospital where she works as a registered nurse, exhaustion visible in the lines around her eyes. Josephine had always been the one struggling financially compared to her brother, a single mother of 2 working double shifts, more often than not, driving a car with over 180,000 miles on it, living in a rented duplex on the other side of town. I'd never once resented her for needing more help than Marcus over the years. Small loans here and there that she always insisted on paying back, even when I told her not to bother. But I'd also never once expected what she did that Thursday afternoon. She set an envelope on my kitchen table without much ceremony. "Dad, I know it's not the full amount, but it's what I've got, $2,000. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell her she couldn't possibly afford this, that she had her own kids to think about, and she cut me off before I could get more than a few words out. "Don't. I already know what you're going to say. I pulled it from the kids' savings account, and I'll put it back before it matters. I promise. You are not going into that surgery worried about money you don't have. That's not happening." I looked at that envelope for a long time before I could bring myself to touch it, feeling something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with cancer and everything to do with the specific, overwhelming grief of realizing the child with the least had somehow given me the most, without a single second of hesitation, while the child with the most had given me a rushed explanation about a $12 million deal. "Joey, I can't take this from you," I said, and my voice cracked on her name in a way it hadn't cracked in years. "You can, and you will," she said, sitting down across from me, taking my hand the way she used to when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. "Dad, I've watched you give Marcus everything for years. The down payment on his first condo, the loan for his business that you never let him fully pay back. I never said anything because that's your money and your choice, and I love my brother. But I'm not going to sit here and watch him let you go into surgery, scared about money, while he's out there buying watches that cost more than my car. That's not who I am, and honestly, it's not who I thought he was either." That night, alone in my kitchen, after Josephine had gone home to relieve the babysitter, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out an old shoebox of financial records I'd kept out of habit, and I actually sat down and added up, for the first time honestly, exactly how much I'd given each of my children over the decades. Marcus, the down payment on his first condo, $18,000. The business loan, $42,000, of which he'd repaid perhaps a third before quietly letting the payments lapse, and me quietly letting him. Countless smaller gifts along the way, always given without hesitation, because I'd been so proud of his ambition that I never once thought to ask whether he'd remember any of it. Josephine, a few thousand here and there over the years, always repaid, always accompanied by an apology for needing it at all. The math wasn't close, and somehow that made what she'd done that afternoon mean even more. Here's something nobody tells you about the moment you finally see your children clearly, without the old assumptions coloring everything. It doesn't just change how you feel about them going forward. It changes how you understand every year that came before, forcing you to look back at decisions you made in good faith and wonder whether you'd been reading the wrong signals the entire time. I did not call Marcus back that week to argue with him or guilt him into changing his mind. I did not tell Josephine that her gift had shattered something in me I wasn't sure how to rebuild. I told myself, quietly, that I needed to focus on the surgery first, that whatever reckoning was coming with Marcus could wait until I was healthy enough to face it properly. My surgeon, Dr. Anwar Siddiqui, performed the procedure 11 days later, and it went as well as anyone could have hoped, the follow-up scans coming back clean, the recovery slow but steady. Marcus called twice during my recovery. Brief calls, checking in the way you'd check in on a coworker who'd had minor surgery, asking if I was doing okay, in a tone that suggested he was already thinking about his next call before I'd finished answering the first question. He never mentioned the $3,500. He never asked whether I'd found the money elsewhere. It was Josephine who drove me to and from every follow-up appointment, who stocked my refrigerator with meals she'd cooked between shifts, who sat with me during the long, boring hours of recovery when there wasn't much to do but watch old westerns and wait to feel like myself again. About 3 weeks into my recovery, during one of those long afternoons, Josephine mentioned something in passing that stopped me cold. "Dad, has Marcus said anything to you about Sable's—" about the deal falling through. I told her I didn't know what she was talking about. Josephine's face did something complicated, like she'd said more than she meant to. I probably shouldn't have brought it up. Forget I said anything. I pressed, gently, the way you press a child when you sense they're protecting someone. It took a little while, but eventually Josephine admitted that she'd heard, through a mutual friend who worked in commercial real estate, that the $12 million deal Marcus had mentioned to me, the one that supposedly left him with no liquid cash to spare for his father's cancer surgery, had actually fallen apart entirely 2 weeks before he ever called me. The deal was dead before that phone call even happened. There was no closing paperwork keeping him buried at the office. There was no commission coming in a month that would have justified waiting. He'd simply lied. If you've been with me a while, you know I don't move on anger alone, especially not with a discovery like this, sitting fresh and raw in my chest. Before I tell you what came next, understand something. Finding out your child lied to you about money during your cancer surgery isn't really about the money at all. It's about understanding, all at once, that the version of your relationship you'd been quietly protecting for years was built on a story he was willing to abandon the moment it became inconvenient to maintain. I spent several days sitting with that information before I decided what to do with it, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath. I did not call Marcus and confront him over the phone, screaming about the lie the way every instinct told me to. I understood that a confrontation like that would let him retreat into defensiveness, spin some new explanation, and I'd be left with nothing but a damaged relationship and no real clarity about who my son had actually become. Instead, I called my brother Dwayne, a retired accountant who'd spent 30 years auditing small businesses before he retired, and asked him, carefully, what it would take to actually understand Marcus's financial situation without asking Marcus directly. Dwayne, ever practical, reminded me that Marcus's business was a licensed brokerage, and that certain filings, business registration status, any liens, Any public records tied to the firm were a matter of public record if you knew where to look. What Dwayne found, over the course of a single afternoon at his computer, painted a picture entirely different from the successful $12 million deal image Marcus had been projecting to me for years. His brokerage had 2 outstanding liens filed against it in the past 18 months, both related to unpaid vendor contracts. A commercial property he'd supposedly closed on the year before, one he'd mentioned to me proudly at the time as proof of how well things were going, had actually gone back to the bank in a deed in lieu of foreclosure filing just 4 months later, a fact he'd never once mentioned to me. And the Range Rover he drove so carefully, the one he kept immaculate, was leased, not owned, 3 payments behind, according to a court filing from a collections matter Dwayne found buried in a public database. "Walton," Dwayne said gently, sliding his notes across the table to me, "I don't think your son turned you down because he's too successful to be bothered with $3,500. I think he turned you down because he genuinely didn't have it, and he was too ashamed to tell you the truth about why." I sat with that revelation for a long time, feeling something shift inside me that I hadn't expected. Not less hurt, exactly, but a different kind of hurt, one layered with something closer to grief for the son I'd been so proud of, who had apparently spent years building a version of himself for me to admire, rather than a version he could actually sustain. I thought about every watch he'd mentioned, every proud comment about a closed deal, every rushed phone call that always somehow circled back to how busy and successful he was, and I understood, for the first time, that I'd been watching a performance for years without ever questioning why he needed to give one. I did not tell Josephine what Dwayne had found. Not right away. I wanted to understand it myself first, and I wanted to give Marcus one honest chance to tell me the truth before I confronted him with facts he didn't know I had. I invited him to Sunday dinner, the first time in months he'd actually come in person rather than sending a check or a text, and I watched him walk in wearing that same watch, driving that same leased Range Rover, talking about a new deal in the pipeline, with the same practiced ease he'd always used, and something in me, watching him perform for an audience of 1 in my own dining room, finally understood what Josephine must have understood months earlier. "Marcus," I said, partway through dinner, keeping my voice as gentle as I could manage, "I know the $12 million deal fell through before you called me about the surgery money." He went very still, his fork halfway to his mouth, color draining slowly from his face. "Dad, I don't know what you... I also know about the liens on the business, and the property that went back to the bank, and the Range Rover payments." I let that sit in the room for a moment, watching 38 years of a carefully maintained image collapse across my own dining room table. "Son, I don't care about the money. I have never once cared about the money. What I care about is that you looked me in the eye. Well, over the phone, but you know what I mean. While I was scared about cancer surgery, and instead of telling me the truth, that you were struggling too, you lied to me and let me believe you just didn't think I was worth the inconvenience." Marcus set his fork down slowly, his hands beginning to shake, and for the first time in years, I watched something crack in my son's carefully maintained composure. "Dad, I couldn't tell you," he said, his voice breaking. "You've always been so proud of me. Every time I saw you, you'd tell people at the diner about my deals, my success, and I couldn't be the one to tell you it's all been falling apart for over a year. I didn't have the $3,500 because I don't have anything, Dad. I'm 3 payments behind on a car I can't afford, my business is drowning, and I've been too ashamed to tell you or anyone else the truth, so I just kept performing, because performing felt easier than admitting I'd failed. Here's something nobody tells you about the moment your anger and your grief collide with an unexpected wave of compassion for the very person who hurt you. It doesn't cancel out what he did. It complicates it, in a way that's almost harder to sit with than pure anger would have been. I looked at my son, 38 years old, sitting across from me with tears in his eyes for the first time since he was a boy. And I understood that the lie he'd told me hadn't come from cruelty. It had come from shame, so deep he'd rather let his father go into cancer surgery without telling him the truth than admit he'd failed. That didn't make it right. I want to be clear about that, because I think it's important. Whatever shame Marcus was carrying, it didn't excuse leaving me to figure out $3,500 for surgery alone, while his sister, who had genuinely nothing to spare, gave without a second thought. But understanding the shame underneath the lie changed what I wanted to do about it, from something aimed at punishment towards something aimed, carefully and deliberately, at actually fixing what had broken between us. I called a family meeting the following weekend, Josephine included, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, all three of us sat at my kitchen table and had an honest conversation about money, about pride, about the different ways each of my children had learned to cope with the pressure of being my child. Marcus, by performing a success he couldn't sustain, and Josephine by quietly absorbing hardship rather than ever asking for more than she strictly needed. I told them both, plainly, that the years of unequal generosity between them had ended that day, not out of punishment toward Marcus, but out of fairness that should have existed all along. I paid Josephine back the $2,000 she'd given me, over her strong objection, and set up a modest fund, split evenly, for both of my grandchildren's education, funded partly by finally, formally forgiving the remaining balance on Marcus's old business loan in exchange for him committing, in writing, to family credit counseling and an honest conversation with Josephine about what he'd actually been going through. If this story has meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you hit subscribe before we go on. It helps keep stories like this going, and it means more to me than you'd know, knowing there are people listening who understand what it feels like to discover the truth about the people you love, even when that truth is complicated rather than simple. Marcus is rebuilding now, slowly, more honestly than he's been in years. And Josephine and I talk most days, the kind of easy, unguarded conversation that money never needed to complicate in the first place. I think about that Thursday afternoon often, the envelope sitting on my kitchen table, $2,000 from a daughter who had every reason to keep it for her own children, and gave it to me anyway without a second's hesitation. I think about the $12 million deal that never existed by the time Marcus told me about it, and the shame that made a grown man lie to his own father rather than admit he was drowning. 6 weeks after that dinner, Marcus showed up at my house unannounced on a Saturday morning, and for a moment, standing in my driveway, his face carried an expression I hadn't seen from him in years. Not the practiced confidence, not the rushed apology, but something rawer, something that looked almost like the boy he used to be before success became something he had to perform rather than something he actually had. He was holding an envelope of his own. "Dad," he said, his voice unsteady in a way I'll remember for the rest of my life. "I know money was never really the point, but I've been picking up extra listings the last few weeks, and I want you to have this back, not to fix what I did, because I know it doesn't fix it. I just need you to know I'm trying to actually be someone worth being proud of again, instead of someone worth bragging about." He held out the envelope, and inside it, counted out carefully in cash, was exactly $3,500.